Multi-hazards, all about protecting communities.
Hello, dear listeners. This episode is where I have a great conversation with Chauncia Willis, co-founder and CEO of the Institute for Diversity and Inclusion in Emergency Management, I-DIEM, and seasoned EM practitioner. But first, let's give a territorial acknowledgement. We work, study, and live in a region south of the Stalo, aka Fraser River, which overlaps with the unceded traditional and ancestral lands of the Kwantlen, Musqueam, Katsi, Semiahmoo, Tsawwassen, Kikite, and Quiquetlam peoples. These are the names of the awesome First Nation groups who have inhabited this land around me since time immemorial. So my guest for today is Chauncia Willis. Chauncia Willis is a certified professional coach, cultural diversity expert, and emergency manager. Her expertise includes disaster management, national security event planning, leadership coaching, immigrant and refugee outreach, as well as diversity, equity, and inclusion training. In her role as CEO for the Institute for Diversity and Inclusion in Emergency Management, she is entrusted to lead the effort to integrate equity into all facets of disaster policy, programs, and practice with the goal of increasing cultural competence and mitigating the harmful impacts of bias on underserved groups. Chauncia's new book is called Stretching: The Race Toward Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in America. It is an audacious book of America's history of racism and discrimination and the current evolution that the country is experiencing. To survive as a nation, America must stretch beyond its past towards a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive future. And you can order the book from her website, Chauncia, that's spelled CHAUNCIA.com. Now, without further ado, let's get to the interview. All right. So this is the Multi-Hazards podcast, and I am so thrilled today. We have Chauncia Willis, and she told me that the name of her organization, they call them I-DIEM, right?
Yes, it's the Institute for Diversity and Inclusion in Emergency Management, and we call it I-DIEM.
Oh, I-DIEM. Okay. Have to be careful how you say these names. Okay. So I'm so thrilled. And Chauncia, I think she's down in Florida or up in Florida, or however you want to say it. And I'm on the other side of the North American continent, or Turtle Island, as Indigenous people call it. I'm in Vancouver.
Oh.
So yeah. So Chauncia, how have you been doing? I know these are really strange and trying times during this pandemic, and it's over a year. And so how have you and the people around you been coping?
Well, that's a great question. And I'll be honest, I try to be as productive with my time as possible. So I actually published a book this year. It's called Stretching: The Race Toward Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in America. I've been writing a lot in other areas, and just writing articles, reading a lot of research that's coming out and soon to be published. So, for me, that's my form of self-care. And it's how I express myself and how I manage stress. I've learned a lot in terms of actually seeing the play that's taken place with the vaccine response, with the pandemic response as a whole. Just seeing and understanding the politics of it, the impact of decisions made. In many ways, it's been disappointing, but in other ways, it's been affirming that what I'm doing and what our organization is all about is much needed, and it has purpose.
Right. Now, I know you have really rich background, and you've been doing emergency management, right? EM.
Uh-huh.
And now the field is inclusion, or they call it diversity, inclusion, and equity, DEI,
Mhm.
and book writing and public speaking. So I'm wondering about if you could give us your background in a nutshell.
Sure, sure. And, it's an interesting background. To me, it's not as wonderful as it could be. Had I been more diligent in my studies, I could, be doing something else that's much more grandiose. But nonetheless, I'm just an emergency manager. So what that means is, we take positions in whether it's in the local government or state or federal government or with a private sector firm, and we manage emergencies. So I'm actually a certified emergency manager. I've been doing this for over 20 years. I started with Atlanta Fulton County Emergency Management Agency and moved on to Georgia Emergency Management Agency and a number of places, but I ended my career as an active emergency manager with the city of Tampa after about 14 years there.
Wow. Okay. That's great. And you're doing coaching now too, and lots of public speaking I saw online.
Yes. And honestly, the public speaking is really centered in executive coaching for those who want to know more about diversity, equity, and inclusion. As applied within their organizations, but also for women in leadership. This is a particularly poignant area for me, just understanding the challenges that women are facing, particularly women of color, women who are approaching their leadership positions with an extra amount of stress. Women of color, particularly Black women who are in positions of leadership, experience stress up to 40% more than other women. So we are judged as soon as we walk in a room. We're judged on the way we speak, our hair, our tone of voice, our name. Like, how dare you show up with a name like Chauncia? I mentioned in my book, having the name Chauncia or having any name that is not a non-white sounding name or non-European sounding name is not always valued and celebrated. And so you have to learn to really, unfortunately, accommodate other people's bias, which can be difficult to do because it requires a level of coping that has to be intentional. You have to process it and understand, okay, their bias is something that I can't control. It's their bias. I can only respond to it in a way that will not hurt my professional career. And that's a decision that many women of color have to make. And it's difficult, and it brings extra stress. And it's just something that we experience in many situations in our work lives.
Right. All I can say to that right now is that the box we have made for people, especially you're saying women of color and many other people, it's so small. And it's just like, it's so easy to sort of be out of the norm because the box is so small. So yeah, all we have to do is like go outside and look at nature and see that the box is pretty wide out there.
Yeah,
very diverse.
Yes. Nature is very diverse, but people are not as accepting of that diversity sometimes. And putting people in a box is the essence of marginalization. And when you are a woman of color, there's intersectionality. So, you could even go further with that by being a woman of color that is differently abled. So now you have these three things that intersect, and there's bias against each one. So you can see how the stress can be compounded. And that's what we really want to do. We first want people to understand that the bias exists, acknowledge it, and then let's work together to mitigate the impact of that bias. And in some ways, if at all possible, let's change that behavior. and combat that bias. But it has to be intentional. And it has to be intentional at an individual level, but also at an organizational level.
Right. Now, I heard that you got together with a friend or colleague named Curtis Brown, and I don't know, you were at a restaurant or something and doing it off the back of serviettes or what are called tablecloths or whatever. And you were like creating this Institute for Diversity and Inclusion in Emergency Management. And then I saw it's just a couple of years, right? And then I read your annual report, or I scanned it, and I was like, whoa, your organization has kind of got up and running and doing so many things in a very short time. So I wonder if you could tell us about your organization.
Absolutely. I'll say this, it was surprising to us as well, how quickly it's taken off. Our organization really began when I was going through a tough time at work. And I remember I was asked to present at a national leadership conference around emergency management. And when I went to the stage, they said, Chauncia, tell us what's on your mind. And I started talking about the perspective of disaster survivors, particularly those who are within a vulnerable population, specifically those who have experienced a disaster, been traumatized by a disaster, but now they're being shamed for not having the resources to be able to have been able to be adequately prepared for that disaster. For example, not having insurance. Well, why didn't you have insurance? Not having 3 days supply of food. Well, why are you asking us for food? You should have had 3 days supply. Essentially not being able to purchase preparedness. And so as I spoke, I realized that I had started tuning out the audience. I talked about what it really felt like to feel and experience the shame that some disaster responders bring to the disaster response, the bias that they bring. I heard one comment in the EOC that basically was, why I wouldn't give those people another thing. All they're going to do is buy a 40 ounce. And I realized they meant the very people that we were there to assist, which was the low income and minority communities. And this was during Hurricane Katrina. So to hear the level of vitriol that some disaster responders and disaster managers had against the populations they were serving, it absolutely broke my heart. I was like, this is just one instance in many that I've heard. And I told the audience what it felt like as a person of color to hear that and to understand that my colleagues who I work with every day really don't have much respect for people who look like me. And so, from that, I spoke to the audience about the inequities that lead to not being able to be prepared. When you have these existing inequities, when you have people that have been redlined into certain communities and, they've been denied loans that are in nicer communities that might not be next to a chemical plant, when you understand the nature and the racism involved in redlining, and you understand that where you live impacts your ability to respond and recover from a disaster, you begin to get the full picture of inequities in disaster management. And so, long story short, when I finished that presentation, they said, you know what, keep talking, tell us what else we need to know. And from that, I decided this is something that needs to be heard. I met with Curtis Brown, who's the emergency state coordinator for the state of Virginia. Mm-hmm. And in the Division of Emergency Management. And we kind of scoped out I-DIEM. We decided this is something that more people need to hear about and know about, and they need to hear us say it. As longtime emergency managers, you need to understand our perspective. And we'd like to help you come up with solutions that are equitable. And so from that, I-DIEM was born.
Wow, that's wonderful. And I saw there's a few newspaper articles after some different disasters, and then they quoted you and your organization.
Yes. That's been a tremendous source of validation, I guess, for the work that we're doing. Many people have known inherently that there is bias in emergency management, it's pervasive throughout America. And so they've known that it exists, but to see the data has been very, very, very influential for many people in changing their minds. Before they saw the research and the data about the inequities, they believed that it could be easily explained. Well, it can't be, because a lot of the policies and programs and practices that are in place today are inequitable. They're based on supporting a system that is biased. So all of those biased systems that we see in America throughout, whether it's medical practice, public health, banking, housing, those same systems are supported in emergency management, and we have to work together to deconstruct those systems so that the policies and practices are not implemented inequitably. And so that's what we're working to do.
Right. Now, I believe, and you mentioned it in your book, that it starts with, I won't say it starts, but one of the biggest parts is staffing. Now, I'm just reading a quote from your book here. It says, for centuries, the default setting in America, and I would add Canada or North America, has been Caucasian, heterosexual, male. Somebody who looks like me. Therefore, the policies, perceptions, practices, etc., are set to quote unquote white male, with white females closely aligned because they generally support their place in society's patriarchal status. And then my question here is about the staffing. And I noticed when I go through LinkedIn that it's got to be one of the whitest professions I've ever seen. And I've been in ESL teaching at colleges, and I've been like the one man in the room, and there's 20 other women, and I'm the only white guy, and it's like 19 other people from all over the world. So it's a really different thing, and it's very white. And it's funny because where I live, it's multicultural Vancouver, but you look at the politicians on the city councils, mostly white. You look at the firefighters, 90% white. The police, mostly white. And then you get to emergency managers, that's also mostly white. And I find it odd, especially when you're being in a multicultural city. So I've seen that that's one of your goals of your organization, is to get the staffing in EM to be more diverse. So I wonder if you can elaborate on that, Chauncia.
Absolutely. And I think that's a great point to make here. We need more representation within the field of emergency management. Right now our field is made up of over 82% white males in positions of leadership. We have our state directors. Only 3 state directors are people of color. Now imagine that. All states and territories in the United States, only 3 are people of color. So why does it matter? Well, it matters because representation matters. It matters because we need different perspectives at the table who are making decisions. We need to have different perspectives to offer a different way of doing things to produce a better outcome. And right now, what we see are a number of emergency managers who don't understand their communities. They don't understand who's in their community. They never bothered to find out through a community demographic assessment. Who's living in our community? What are their needs? What are their challenges to preparedness? How can we include everyone and not just say we're taking a whole community approach? How can we ensure that our community is represented within our leadership? How can we ensure that our leaders look like the communities they're serving? And when you don't have that, when you have, as you said, that imbalance, you also have an imbalance in priority. So the needs of those most vulnerable communities, those communities that have been marginalized, historically marginalized, they are not priority. They are not prioritized in consideration for planning, nor for funding, or for any of those areas. And so we have to be honest, and we have to call it what it is, and say that it's not right, it's not equitable, and we have the data to demonstrate that we need change in those areas. So we need more representation.
Right. Now, another area is planning. And last week I interviewed a climate scientist who's indigenous from Australia named Tony Hay. And she was mentioning that it's the same thing where if you're not at the table, what's that sentence? You're going to be on the menu. And I have a hearing problem. So I heard somebody say that. And I thought it says, if you're not at the table, you're on the news tonight. So
right.
I thought, well, maybe my hearing problem is a benefit. But she was saying that for planning, for example, in Australia, Indigenous people need to be included in climate change adaptation planning, embedded throughout the entire process, not just come in as an afterthought, not just hire one Indigenous person to, where the room is, 95% white, and then there's maybe two people. It has to be embedded throughout the process in order to get the results at the end. So that was the gist of what she said. So that's what you're saying too. And I read that in your book. Can't remember which page.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The thing about it is that many times groups, leaders are not familiar with working with marginalized groups right next to them at the table. And, they just aren't comfortable working with groups that have been historically marginalized. It is unfamiliar. I've even heard someone told me, Chauncia, we would prefer to hear about diversity, equity, and inclusion from someone who is white. We don't want to hear or learn about these topics from people of color, especially because we're a white organization. And that's bias. So those groups will have trouble working with people of color because they just aren't familiar with it, and their bias prevents them from wanting to seek that out. So when you lack that diverse representation at the table, all of your plans look different. Your programs that you create for communities, that you create for your company, everything will look different because you're missing that diverse perspective, and it's needed. And it's been demonstrated to be beneficial to the bottom line as well.
Right. And, honestly, Chauncia, I've seen that, it's like, okay, there were the protests last year with Black Lives Matter, and there's a lot of people jumping on the diversity bandwagon. But for example, I was telling you before our podcast that I've been spending, since I was a teenager, basically all my time with people of color, right? Mm-hmm. And that has been decades and decades. And then I still have things I'm working through, I'm reading up, I'm researching as a white person, because I've been in this bubble of whiteness, even though I've been trying to break out of the bubble for decades. But this change cannot come in a 1 hour workshop or even a 1 week workshop. This is a thorough change. So, but people, for example, the Black communities or Latinx or other communities, they've been living it all along. So if they do the planning and they become emergency managers, it's just so much easier than, somebody who needs to go through a so-called, it's sort of like the Matrix movie. I don't know if you ever watched that, but when Neo goes into he gets reborn and he goes into the thing. It's a long process for people. I'm even on Facebook groups where white people are trying to understand all this. It's a long process, very drawn out, and no guarantee you're going to get it right at the end. But it's much preferable to hire people who understand right away. That's what I think. And then, of course, so too.
Yeah, I think so too. You're absolutely right. It's not about us without us. And oftentimes leaders are attempting to make these plans and put these things in place by, intentionally, or even in some cases unintentionally excluding people of color or people who are representing the communities that they don't have established connections with. And so, that perspective will provide the mindset of the community, the methods of communication that work, that will hit the mark, the ways in which the communal identity is formed and sustained. And many times, if you're not from that community, you can assume, oh, well, that's an interesting way to do that, not understanding what value that is for that community. I was just talking with a colleague the other day about the prevalence of people who have been forced to move after a disaster, and those buyouts. When you really look at who's being bought out, it's primarily those who are from lower income areas. It's people of color, and it's unfortunate because the impact of that is that community loses its identity. And in addition, because they're in a lower income community, the value of that property is not going to allow them to establish a nicer or better, more wholesome household in a better area. So that's really not a good solution for a great majority of people, but their voices are never heard and it's never considered because that perspective is not at the table. And so what happens is essentially you have organizations who begin to create and cultivate performative equity. They create checklists that really don't have a human connection. And they come up with policies and programs that look on the surface like they're going to have great impact, but in the end, they really don't. So that's why that perspective at the table is so needed.
Right. Now, when we say the word vulnerable, this is kind of side question here, but we say the word vulnerable, and we talk about people who are poor, for example, and then I guess automatically people are thinking, okay, this is Black, Latinx, and Indigenous or other groups, right? And also I would include, there's actually pretty big groups of poorer white people. Mm-hmm. But I know where I live in the city of Vancouver, and probably the cities that you're in, your organization is in, that people have been getting poorer the last, say, 10, 20 years. Like, it's harder to stay afloat economically, and it's much easier to be losing your income year by year instead of sort of climbing up the social ladder. A lot of us are kind of climbing down. So what does it mean is that there are more people who are poor than, say, 10, 20, 30 years ago. And then that adds to the disaster risk. And so I see here, it says in your quote here on your website, that it is my belief that there is a fierce urgency of now. And I don't know if that's what you were thinking about when you said that, but I see that what you're doing and your goal there, it becomes ever more important because it seems in a lot of ways the situation, like, for example, economically, is getting worse.
Absolutely. The situation is getting more dire. The coronavirus pandemic had a significant economic impact, negative impact in many households. And that's unfortunate. So the number of those who were negatively impacted actually increased, especially those who were out of work for a significant amount of time. Climate change is also adding to the urgency of now. Climate change is going to have significant negative impact on those who, as you say, are categorized as vulnerable populations. The disasters are going to be more costly. They're going to be more frequent. And in addition, they're going to have greater impact. So when we think about climate change and its impacts, the people who will feel the impacts and who will experience that disaster, unfortunately, will be those who are most vulnerable to it already. And when we consider our historically marginalized groups, and as you mentioned, those who are from a lower income, they do not have the ability, if they're focused on survival, to purchase a level of preparedness, whether it's buying a home that's not in a repetitive flood area or near a coastal area, whether it's buying flood insurance. A lot of these preparedness tactics that we use in emergency management are based on having available financing and funds in the bank. Well, we know that most people don't have $400 to put towards an emergency, who are from a lower socioeconomic bracket, not even $400. So when you talk about everyone needs to be prepared and purchase their preparedness insurance,